The first time I understood how badly they'd underestimated me was the morning I stood at my kitchen window, coffee gone cold in my hands, watching a convoy of black SUVs grind to a halt at the locked gate at the bottom of my pasture. Engines idled, doors opened and slammed. Voices carried up the valley, sharp and confused. Someone tried the keypad again, someone else kicked the dust. And I remember thinking with a calm that surprised even me, this is where it begins, not the shouting. Not the lawsuits. Right here in the silence between revving engines and an old iron chain stretched across a road they thought belonged to them. That road was older than any of us, older than the county records building, older than the polished renderings and sales brochures calling my home Phase 1 access. And I owned every inch of it, but I didn't always know that. When people picture a farm, they imagine something flat and gentle, red barns, white fences. My place was nothing like that. It sat folded into a mountain valley like a kept secret, 47 acres my grandfather bought after the war when land was cheap and promises were expensive. Pines leaned in close. The creek sang even in drought. Wind came down the ridgeline every evening at dusk, carrying the smell of sap and wet stone. It wasn't rich land. It was stubborn land, and it raised stubborn people. I grew up listening to the creak of the porch boards and the cough of the old diesel tractor starting up before sunrise. My father used to say the valley had moods. You learned them or you paid for it. Flash floods in August, mudslides in March, snow that cut you off for days if you didn't stock up. We weren't poor, but we were never comfortable. Every dollar came with dirt under its fingernails. When my parents passed, first Dad from a stroke, then Mom 2 winters later, the farm came to me along with a stack of yellowed folders tied with twine. Deeds, surveys. Letters written in fountain pen ink that had faded to the color of rust. I didn't read them then. Grief has a way of making paper feel heavier than stone. I put the box in the closet and focused on surviving, kept the hay fields going, fixed fence, paid taxes, lived quietly. For years nothing changed. Then one spring the county trucks came. At first it was subtle. Orange flags appeared along the ridge road, survey stakes hammered into ground that had never known steel. Then came the meetings. Notices taped to the bulletin board at the feed store. Community Development Update. That was the first time I heard the name of the Homeowners Association. Ridgeview Crest. Luxury mountain living, the flyers said. Spa, vineyard, private lake, gated community. I remember sitting in the back of the folding chair-packed hall, the smell of coffee and perfume mixing in the air, listening to men in tailored jackets talk about my valley like it was an empty page. They spoke in square footage and ROI. They pointed at maps where my farm was a pale green shape labeled adjacent parcel. Not home, not land, just adjacent. After the meeting, one of them found me by the door. He had teeth too white for the mountains and a handshake like a clamp. Good news for you, he said, smiling. Your property value is about to skyrocket. I smiled back. I'm not selling, he laughed like I'd told a joke. Everyone sells. That was the first lie. Construction began before the permits were even dry. The sound came first. Distant, metallic like thunder that didn't move. Then the dust. It drifted over my hay fields, settled on my windowsills, coated the leaves of my apple trees. Trucks roared past my gate from dawn until after dark, tearing ruts into the old access road that cut through my land. The same road my grandfather had carved with a mule and a blade. I went down to the site one morning, boots sinking into churned mud, and asked the foreman who'd authorized use of my road. He didn't even look up from his clipboard. HOAs got an easement. I asked to see it. He shrugged. Take it up with the office. The office was glass and steel, perched on the ridge like it already owned the view. That's where I met her. The HOA president, perfect hair, perfect smile, a voice trained to sound patient even when it was. We're within our rights, she said, folding her hands. Progress is uncomfortable sometimes. Here's something most people don't know. In rural counties, a lot of access roads are what developers think they are. They look public, they feel public, but unless they were formally dedicated, they're private. And unless there's a recorded easement, they're off limits. I told her that. She smiled thinner. Our legal team disagrees. The harassment started quietly, letters first, then emails, notices citing violations I'd never heard of, tall grass, unsafe structures, environmental concerns. A county inspector showed up one afternoon, clipboard in hand, eyes apologetic. Just doing my job, he said, as if that explained why he'd never been up my drive before. Then the rumors, that I was anti-development, that I was hoarding land, that I'd inherited wealth and wanted to strangle opportunity. None of it true, but lies travel faster when they're writing money. One night, I came home to find a flyer taped to my gate. RIDGVIEW Crest, community meeting. Discussing access issues caused by neighboring landowner. That was me, reduced to an issue. Inside, my house smelled like wood smoke and old books. Rain tapped the tin roof. I sat at the table where my parents had once argued over bills and spread the flyer flat. For the first time in years, I thought about selling, about taking the money and leaving the valley to its fate. The thought tasted bitter, like giving up a piece of myself I couldn't get back. Instead, I went to the closet. The box of papers was heavier than I remembered. Dust puffed into the air when I opened it. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and started reading by the yellow light of a single bulb. Deeds written in careful script. A survey dated 1948. A letter from a county engineer thanking my grandfather for maintaining the sole access route through parcel 17B sole access. My heart started to beat faster, not with anger, but with something steadier. Focus. Over the next weeks I dug. County archives that smelled like mildew and thyme. Maps rolled and unrolled. Microfilm machines whining softly in the background. I learned the valley the way my grandfather must have, inch by inch, line by line. I learned that the road had never been dedicated, that it crossed my land entirely, that the so-called easement the HOA claimed referenced a different route that washed out in 1962 and was never rebuilt. Meanwhile, Ridgeview Crest announced their grand opening date. Billboards went up. "Arrive in style," they said. Investors toured the site in helicopters that chopped the air above my roof. The HOA president went on local radio talking about community and growth, and every single one of them assumed they could drive right in. The day the sheriff came was hot and dry, cicadas screaming from the trees. He parked at my gate, hat tipped back, hand resting near his belt but not on it. "We've had complaints," he said carefully, "about obstruction." I gestured to the chain. "It's my road," he sighed. "That's what you say." I handed him copies, deeds, surveys. His eyes moved slower now. "I'll have to take this in," he said. "Please do." That night, I stood on the porch listening to the wind come down the valley, carrying the distant hum of generators from the construction site. Lights glowed where darkness used to live. Somewhere up there, plans were being made that didn't include me. They still thought this was a bluff, a nuisance, a farmer clinging to dirt. They didn't know that the only road into their luxury resort ran straight through my land, and that the law, quiet and patient, was finally on my side. And the next morning, when the first concrete trucks tried to roll in and found the gate locked, the valley held its breath. By noon that day, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating on the kitchen table. Unknown numbers, voicemails stacking up faster than I could listen to them. The sound blended with the low mechanical growl echoing from the valley floor, engines revving and dying, revving again like a beast confused by a closed door. I let the phone buzz. I poured fresh coffee and stood at the window, watching dust settle back onto the road where nothing moved anymore. Silence has weight when people expect noise. The first voicemail I listened to was polite. A man introduced himself as counsel for Ridgeview Crest. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words that might slide past my defenses without triggering them. He mentioned misunderstandings, temporary measures, mutually beneficial solutions. He asked me to call back. The second was less patient. The third was openly irritated. By evening, the HOA president herself left a message. Her voice, so smooth in person, carried an edge now. She said I was interfering with lawful construction. She said delays cost money. She said they were prepared to pursue all available remedies. I deleted it and stepped outside. The air smelled like hot pine needles and diesel. The sun slid behind the ridge, painting the sky in bands of orange and bruised purple. Down below, work lights flicked on at the resort site, illuminating half-built structures that looked skeletal without motion. I'd never seen the valley lit like that at night. It felt wrong, like someone had turned on a lamp in a church during a funeral. That was the night doubt crept in. Not loud doubt, quiet doubt. The kind that whispers when you're alone. I thought about the money they had, the lawyers, the judges who golfed with developers. I thought about being labeled the problem, the obstruction, the reason people lost jobs. I imagined losing. Imagined a court ordering the gate removed, the road seized, my land carved up by machines that never slept. I slept badly. Dreamed of my father standing at the gate, hand on the chain, looking back at me without speaking. The next morning, the pressure became physical. A pickup I didn't recognize parked across from my drive for hours, engine running. When I went to town for feed, someone had scrawled greedy in marker on my tailgate. The county inspector returned, this time with a different expression. Tighter. He cited me for runoff issues caused by construction trucks churning mud onto my fields. I laughed once, short and sharp, then stopped when I saw he wasn't joking. "They say you're being unreasonable," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "They say a lot of things." By the end of the week, I was served, thick envelope, heavy paper. A request for emergency injunctive relief compelling access. They wanted a judge to force me to open the road while the case proceeded. Here's something most people do know. Emergency motions are where power flexes. They move fast. They favor whoever sounds like the bigger disruption. And a stalled luxury resort with investors watching looks on paper, a lot more disruptive than one quiet farmer. I drove to the county seat in a rainstorm so hard it blurred the world into streaks of gray. The courthouse smelled like old carpet and anxiety. I sat on a hard bench while men in suits whispered into phones, laughing like nothing was at stake. My attorney, a local guy with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie, leaned close. "They're pushing hard," he said. "Judge could grant temporary access. And then what? Then we appeal or negotiate." Negotiate. The word tasted like metal. When the hearing ended, the judge took the matter under advisement. No immediate order, a pause, a crack of light. That pause was everything. I went home and worked until my hands hurt. I walked the road from end to end, measuring, photographing, documenting every rut, every culvert, every place water crossed. I found where my grandfather had diverted runoff decades ago, stonework hidden under moss. I pulled records from the state environmental office showing protected wetlands just downhill from the construction entrance. Wetlands that heavy traffic would destroy. At night, I listened to recordings of county commission meetings, dry voices, procedural language, and then I heard it. A casual mention of temporary access approval pending formal easement verification. Approval that had never gone through public comment. Approval signed off by a deputy who used to work for the same developer now building the resort. Connections, always connections. Meanwhile, Ridgeview Crest escalated. They hired a PR firm. Articles appeared about anti-growth landowners stalling local prosperity. My name wasn't printed, but it didn't need to be. People knew. A woman at the grocery store shook her head at me. "Why can't you just compromise?" she asked. Because compromise assumes equal footing. We didn't have that. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning under a sky so blue it looked fake. I was at the gate when the black SUVs returned, more of them this time. Doors opened in unison. Shoes crunched on gravel. The HOA president walked up first, flanked by two men who radiated expensive confidence. "This has gone far enough," she said, stopping just short of the chain. "You're hurting people." I nodded toward the silent site. "You built without securing access." One of the men laughed. "You think a road gives you power?" I looked at him, really looked. He had no dust on his shoes, no idea what this land did when it rained. "I think the law does," I said. They offered money then, real money, numbers that made my chest tighten, enough to leave, enough to never worry again. I thought of my father's hands, cracked and scarred, of my mother planting tomatoes by the creek, of the nights when the only sound was wind and water and something ancient settling into sleep. "No," I said. That's when the mask slipped. "You're making a mistake," the president said, her voice sharp now. "We can make this very difficult." She didn't have to explain how. The lawsuits multiplied, complaints filed with state agencies, anonymous tips about code violations, someone called animal control claiming neglect. The stress settled into my bones. Some nights I sat at the table staring at nothing, the hum of the fridge loud in the quiet, wondering how much one person could take. Then, buried in a stack of documents I'd scanned and re-scanned, I found it. A federal filing from the 1950s. Water rights adjudication. My grandfather's name. The road wasn't just access. It was the maintenance route for a registered irrigation control structure that served multiple downstream parcels, including land now owned by the HOA. Any alteration, any obstruction required federal review, and any unauthorized use risked serious penalties. My hands shook as I read it again and again. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a regulatory nightmare for them. I sent copies to my attorney. His reply came back fast. One line. "This changes everything." We didn't announce it. We waited. The judge scheduled a second hearing. Investors were flying in. Pressure was peaking. Ridgeview Crest filed another motion, more aggressive than the last. They wanted sanctions. They wanted to paint me as reckless. The night before the hearing, rain returned. Hard, relentless. I stood on the porch watching water surge down the road, exactly where the old stone channels guided it. Down below at the construction entrance, muddy water pooled and spilled into the marked wetland zone. I recorded it, every second. In court the next day, their attorney spoke first, voice smooth, hands expressive. He talked about progress, jobs, community benefit. He talked about me like I wasn't there. Then it was our turn. My attorney laid out the deeds, the lack of easement, the improper approvals, the wetland violations, and finally the federal filing. The room changed. You could feel it. Papers stopped rustling. The judge leaned forward. "Is this accurate?" she asked their counsel. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. The judge ordered a temporary halt to construction pending full review. No access, no work, no exceptions. When we stepped out into the rain, my attorney exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. "They're in trouble," he said. Down the steps across the street, the HOA president stood under an umbrella, phone pressed to her ear, her face pale. I drove home through puddles that reflected the sky, heart pounding not with fear now, but with something steadier. Momentum. But power doesn't collapse quietly. As I pulled into my drive, headlights flared behind me. Another vehicle, unmarked, following too close. I parked. The engine idled behind me, and for the first time since this began, I wondered just how far they were willing to go. The headlights stayed on even after I shut my engine off. They flooded my rearview mirror with white glare, turning the inside of my truck into a washed-out tunnel. I sat there, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the rush of blood in my ears. Rain slid down the windshield in uneven lines. The valley felt smaller in that moment, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I got out slowly. The other vehicle didn't move, no door opened. No window rolled down, just the hum of an idling engine and those lights, steady and patient. It wasn't overt, that was the point. It was a reminder, we know where you live. I stepped aside, walked to my gate, unlocked it, and swung it open with deliberate calm. The chain clinked softly, a sound that had started to mean something to me. When I looked back, the headlights finally dimmed. The vehicle turned around and disappeared down the road, tires hissing on wet gravel. I stood there for a long time after, rain soaking through my jacket, breathing in the smell of damp earth and pine. Fear was there, sure, but beneath it something harder had settled. Resolve tempered by anger and sharpened by clarity. The next morning the pressure shifted from intimidation to desperation. Emails arrived hourly, requests for meetings, offers to revisit terms. One message came from a consultant who claimed to represent a group of concerned investors. He wanted to talk off the record. I forwarded everything to my attorney and kept my mouth shut. Silence, I was learning, was a weapon too. Construction at Ridgeview Crest ground to a halt. No trucks. No helicopters, just the skeletal frames of buildings standing awkwardly against the hills, tarps snapping in the wind. Workers were sent home. The local diner buzzed with rumors. Some blamed me outright. Others started asking questions about how a project that big could stall so suddenly. That's when the county commission called for a special session. The meeting was held in the high school gym, folding chairs arranged in rows under flickering lights. It smelled like floor polish and old sweat. I sat near the back, notes folded in my pocket, listening as commissioners spoke in careful tones about community impact and unforeseen complications. When public comment opened, the room shifted. A man in a Ridgeview polo shirt stood up first, voice tight. He talked about lost wages. A woman followed, eyes flashing, accusing unnamed obstructionists of holding progress hostage. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then someone else stood, an older rancher I recognized from up the valley. He cleared his throat and spoke slowly, deliberately, about water runoff, about how the creek had changed since construction began, about land that held memory and deserved respect. Heads turned, the narrative cracked. When my name was finally called, the room quieted in a way that felt almost physical. I walked to the microphone, heart steady now. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I laid out facts. The road, the lack of easement, the federal water rights filing. The environmental violations documented after the rain. Here, as something most people don't know, truth doesn't need volume, it needs clarity and receipts. By the time I sat down, the commissioners were avoiding eye contact with the Ridgeview representatives. One of them whispered furiously into a phone. 2 days later, the story broke wider. A regional paper ran a piece headlined, "Luxury Resort Faces Legal Snarl Over Access and Water Rights." It wasn't flattering. They quoted anonymous officials questioning how approvals had been rushed through. They mentioned potential federal penalties. The word investigation appeared 3 times. The calls from investors started that afternoon, not to me, to Ridgeview Crest. You could feel it in the air. Panic had a smell, sharp and acrid like burnt coffee. That didn't stop the retaliation. One morning, I woke to find my mailbox smashed, metal bent inward like a crushed can. No note, no signature, just damage. The sheriff took a report, his pen moving slowly across the page. "Probably kids," he said, but his eyes didn't convince even him. A week later, my bank called. There was an issue with my line of credit. A review, they said, routine. It froze my account for 3 days, long enough to make a point. I spent those days walking the land, grounding myself in things that didn't lie. The creek swollen from rain, singing louder than usual. The fence line where deer tracks pressed into soft mud. The old apple tree my mother planted, leaves shining green and defiant. At night, I went back to the papers. The more I read, the more the picture sharpened. Ridgeview Crest wasn't just sloppy. They were reckless. Permits referenced parcels they didn't own yet. Environmental impact assessments copy-pasted from another county. Signatures that didn't match official records. I compiled everything into a timeline, dates, names, cross-references. It felt less like revenge and more like archaeology brushing dirt away to reveal something ugly underneath. Then the letter arrived, certified mail, heavy envelope. The return address was a federal agency. They were opening a formal inquiry. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, listening to the wind push against the house. This was bigger than me now, bigger than the county. And for the first time, the weight of that scared me. Because federal investigations don't just burn one house. They scorch whole neighborhoods. Ridgeview Crest reacted exactly how you'd expect. They went public. A press conference was held on the ridge, cameras lined up against a backdrop of half-finished luxury. The HOA president stood at a podium, voice steady but eyes darting. She spoke about cooperation, about compliance, about one individual exploiting loopholes to extort a community. My phone exploded. Messages from people I barely knew, some supportive, some furious. One warned me to watch myself. That night someone tried to cut the chain on my gate. They didn't succeed. The bolt cutters left scratches, metal scarred but intact. I replaced the chain with a thicker one and installed cameras, hands shaking not from fear now but from the sheer audacity of it. I didn't sleep. The next morning I drove into town to meet my attorney. As we sat in his office, sunlight slanting through blinds and dust motes floating like tiny planets, he laid it out. "They're hemorrhaging money," he said. "Investors are pulling, contractors are filing claims, the HOA board is fracturing." "Good," I said, though my stomach twisted. "Collapse is messy. Innocent people get caught in it." "There's more," he added. "They filed a countersuit alleging tortious interference. They want damages." Of course they did. The court date was set. A real one this time. Not an emergency motion. A full hearing with evidence, testimony, the works. The kind of thing that decides futures. In the weeks leading up to it, I was deposed. Hours in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee, answering questions designed to trip me, to paint me as calculating, malicious. I stayed calm, told the truth, let the record speak. Across the table, their lead attorney watched me with narrowed eyes. He knew now, they all did. The road wasn't just a road. It was leverage they couldn't buy or bully away. The night before the hearing, a storm rolled in heavier than any before. Wind howled down the valley, bending trees, rattling windows. Power flickered and went out. I lit candles and sat at the table, shadows dancing on the walls, listening to the storm rage. For a moment, doubt returned. Not about the facts, about the cost. I thought about the workers who'd been sent home, about neighbors caught between loyalties. About the way justice, even when earned, never arrives clean. I almost called the number they'd left months ago, almost asked what compromise might look like now. Instead, I blew out the candles and went to bed. The hearing began under clear skies. The storm washed away. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Ridgeview's representatives sat stiff and pale, stacks of binders in front of them. When testimony turned to access to water, to the federal inquiry, the mood shifted again. Witnesses contradicted each other. Documents didn't line up. A county official invoked the Fifth Amendment. The judge's expression hardened. By the afternoon, it was clear this wasn't going the way Ridgeview Crest had planned. Whispers passed between their attorneys. One of them stepped out to take a call and didn't come back for 20 minutes. When proceedings recessed for the day, I stepped outside into sunlight that felt too bright. Across the steps, the HOA president stood alone, phone in hand, staring at the screen like it had betrayed her. As I walked past, she looked up. "This doesn't end here," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "It never does." That evening, as I drove home through the valley, something caught my eye near the ridge road. A survey crew, new stakes, fresh paint. I pulled over, heart pounding, and read the markings. They weren't marking the resort. They were marking my land. The stakes gleamed white against the darkening soil, little flags fluttering like warnings in the evening breeze. I got out of the truck and walked the lines slowly, boots crunching on gravel, fingers brushing the painted wood. They ran parallel to the road, precise and deliberate, slicing my land into neat, imaginary segments. For a moment, the valley felt foreign, like it had shifted while I wasn't looking. Eminent domain. The word settled into my chest like a stone. By the time I reached home, the phone was already ringing. My attorney didn't waste time. "They're trying to force access through condemnation," he said. "County petition, claiming public necessity." Public necessity for a private luxury resort. Here's something most people don't know. Eminent domain is one of the most abused tools in local government, but it's also one of the most regulated. The threshold for public use is high, higher than golf carts and spa deliveries. And when federal interests intersect, water rights, environmental protections, the whole thing becomes radioactive. Still, the attempt rattled me. It was escalation, naked and bold. They weren't pretending anymore. The next weeks blurred into a rhythm of paperwork and waiting rooms. The county scheduled hearings, notices were posted, letters sent. I attended every session, sitting under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, listening to officials dance around language that couldn't quite justify what they were proposing. The developers' representatives spoke about emergency services access, about hypothetical benefits to the region. I spoke about history, about law, about a road that had never been public and never needed to be. Outside, autumn crept in. Leaves yellowed, then burned red. The air sharpened. Each morning, frost kissed the fields. The resort site stood frozen in half-finished ambition, tarps flapping, rebar rusting. Money bled quietly there every day without progress, a wound they couldn't close. Pressure came from new angles. A state agency requested additional documentation on my water usage. A lender asked for updated appraisals. A nonprofit sent a letter urging me to consider the broader community good. I read everything, answered what needed answering, and ignored the rest. At night, I dreamed of the road. Sometimes it stretched endlessly, disappearing into fog. Sometimes it crumbled under my feet. I woke before dawn, heart racing, and walked outside to remind myself it was still there, solid beneath my boots. The condemnation hearing was scheduled for mid-October. The room was packed again, tension thick as the smell of wet coats. Ridgeview Crest had brought in outside counsel this time, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke with confidence about precedent, about economic. She tried to frame the taking as minimal, reasonable. Then my attorney stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He introduced evidence. The federal inquiry letter, the environmental reports, the irrigation control structure designation. He explained how condemning the road would interfere with federally protected water infrastructure, how it would expose the county to liability far exceeding any imagined benefit. A murmur ran through the room. The county's own counsel shifted uncomfortably. One commissioner stared down at his notes like they might swallow him. When the hearing ended, no decision was announced. Another pause, another breath held. Outside, cameras flashed. A reporter asked if I was trying to stop progress. I told her progress that tramples law isn't progress at all. She wrote it down. That night, the wind came hard from the north. It rattled the house and sent branches scraping against the siding. I sat at the table, lamp casting a small circle of light, reading an email from a man I'd never met. He said he worked for a fund that had invested heavily in Ridgeview Crest. He wanted to talk, discreetly. I almost deleted it. Instead, I replied with a single line, "Have your counsel contact mine." The meeting happened in a quiet office 2 towns over. Neutral ground. The man was younger than I expected, his suit expensive but rumpled. He looked tired. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. "We didn't know," he said simply. "About the access, about the approvals, we relied on representations." "You still are," I said. He rubbed his eyes. "We're bleeding capital. There's talk of pulling out entirely. And if that happens, this thing collapses." There it was, the truth laid bare, not anger, not pride, fear. I didn't gloat, I didn't bargain. I told him to talk to his lawyers, to read the filings, to understand that shortcuts come with consequences. When I left, the sky was low and gray, threatening snow. The valley felt quieter than it had in months, like it was watching, waiting. The county's decision came a week later. The condemnation petition was denied. The letter was short, procedural, citing insufficient public necessity and unresolved federal conflicts. I read it twice, then sat back in my chair, breath leaving me in a long, shaky exhale. Outside, a gust of wind sent leaves skittering across the yard like applause. Ridgeview Crest didn't issue a statement. They didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any press release. What came next was the unraveling. Contractors filed liens. Employees sued for unpaid wages. The HOA board splintered, resignations announced in terse emails. The president vanished from public view. Rumors swirled of internal investigations, of documents shredded too late. The federal inquiry deepened. Agents visited the site, measurements taken, samples collected. The words "potential criminal exposure" appeared in a memo my attorney forwarded, followed by a line he'd underlined twice. "This is not going away. Through it all, I stayed put. I fixed fence. I cut firewood. I met with neighbors who'd once avoided my eyes and now wanted to talk. Some apologized, some didn't. That was okay. Healing doesn't require unanimity." One afternoon, a knock came at my door. A man stood there in a windbreaker with an agency badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself politely, asked if he could come in. We sat at the table where I'd read the first letter weeks before. He asked about the road, about my grandfather, about maintenance. I answered honestly. When he left, the house felt heavier but cleaner somehow, like a storm had scrubbed the air. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the ridge, then blanketed it. The resort site vanished beneath white, unfinished structures poking up like bones. Access roads went unplowed. No one came. The valley returned to itself. I thought it was over. Then in late January, a process server found me at the feed store. He handed me an envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was a notice. Ridgeview Crest LLC had filed for bankruptcy protection. The implications rippled outward instantly. Creditors, courts, asset sales, and somewhere in that tangle, my land, my road, my valley. That night I sat by the fire watching flames lick at seasoned wood, thinking about endings and beginnings. Bankruptcy didn't mean accountability. It meant reorganization. It meant deals struck in rooms I'd never see. A week later, my attorney called with a tone I hadn't heard before, not urgent, not worried, measured. "There's a proposal," he said. "From the trustee." I closed my eyes. What kind of proposal? A settlement. They want to walk away, fully, restore the land they disturbed. Vacate claims, pay damages. And the road, a pause just long enough. They want you to dedicate it. My grip tightened on the phone. Outside, snow fell silently, covering tracks, erasing signs of passage. "I won't," I said. "I figured you'd say that," he replied. "There's more." "Of course there is. They're willing to dissolve the HOA entirely, transfer remaining common land into a conservation trust, in exchange for permanent access rights elsewhere. Elsewhere, not through me." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. I watched them fade into smoke. "Send me everything," I said. When I hung up, the house was quiet. The valley lay buried under white, peaceful and deceptive. I knew better now than to trust quiet too much. The papers arrived 2 days later, thick, complex. The kind of documents that decide futures with commas and clauses. I read them slowly, carefully, line by line. Somewhere in the middle I saw it. A clause about legacy obligations, about stewardship. About public access limits that protected privacy and land use. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it was close. I set the papers down and walked outside. Snow crunched underfoot. The moon cast the valley in silver. I stood at the gate, hand resting on the chain, and listened. No engines, no voices, just wind and the distant rush of the creek, still flowing, still mine to protect. In the silence, I realized the fight wasn't about winning anymore. It was about choosing what came after. I took a week before I answered. Not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I needed to be sure it wasn't anger making the choice for me. Anger is useful in small doses. It gets you to stand up. It keeps you awake when you'd rather look away, but if you let it drive at the end, it will take you somewhere you don't actually want to live. Each morning that week, I walked the valley. Snow crunched under my boots, clean and honest. The air smelled sharp, almost sweet. I followed the creek where it slipped under ice and re-emerged, patient and unstoppable. I stood on the ridge road and looked down at the resort site, now nothing but white shapes and shadows, ambition frozen mid-breath. I thought about my grandfather carving that road with a mule and a blade, not to dominate the land, but to live with it. I thought about my parents teaching me that ownership wasn't control. It was responsibility. On the 7th day, I called my attorney. "We'll accept," I said. "With conditions." The negotiations took another month. Slow, careful, deliberate, words weighed and reweighed, clauses tightened, protections layered on protections. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Ridgeview Crest LLC was liquidated. The brand vanished like it had never existed. The access road was rerouted far from my land, carved at their expense through terrain that fought them every inch of the way. Engineers cursed the rock. Budgets exploded. But it was theirs to deal with now. My road remained mine. The damaged land was restored under supervision. Heavy machinery came one last time not to build but to undo. Soil was tested and replaced. Native grasses replanted. Drainage corrected. It took months. I watched it all, sometimes from a distance, sometimes up close, asking questions, holding people accountable, not out of spite, out of duty. The settlement included damages, enough to secure the farm's future, enough to set aside funds for conservation, enough to breathe. When the final papers were signed, there was no press conference. No applause, just a quiet meeting room, the scratch of pens, the shuffle of documents sliding into folders. Outside, spring had arrived. Snowmelt fed the creek, swelling it into a song that filled the valley. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and promise. People started stopping by again, neighbors, old friends, even a few who'd once crossed the street to avoid me. Conversations were awkward at first, then easier. Apologies offered. Accepted, not all wounds close cleanly, but time helps if you let it. One afternoon, the sheriff came up the drive. He took his hat off before he spoke. "Just wanted to say," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "You did it the right way." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. Summer followed, full and loud. Cicadas screamed. Hay dried in the fields. The apple tree bloomed and set fruit heavier than it had in years, branches sagging under the weight. I fixed fences. Repaired the old barn roof. Life resumed its steady rhythm, the kind you only notice when it's been disrupted. Sometimes, when the light was just right, I could still see where the resort had tried to impose itself on the land. Faint scars, lines that didn't quite belong. Nature was already softening them, erasing sharp edges, reclaiming space. I let it. The county commission changed faces that fall. Elections have a way of responding to exposed truth. New policies were drafted. Access requirements tightened. Environmental reviews strengthened. It wasn't perfect. Systems rarely are, but it was better than before. Here's something most people don't know. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like correction, like preventing the next wrong before it happens. One evening near the anniversary of that first locked gate, I sat on the porch as the sun slid behind the ridge. The valley breathed. Wind moved through grass in waves. Somewhere down the creek, a frog called, answered by another. I thought about how close I'd come to selling, to walking away, to letting someone else decide what this place would become. I thought about the doubt, the fear, the nights when the weight felt unbearable, and I thought about the road. It still lay there, quiet and unassuming, a strip of earth and stone most people would never notice. But it held the story of everything that had happened. A reminder that leverage doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like patience, like paper. Like knowing what you have before someone else tells you what it's worth. The gate creaked softly as I closed it for the night. The chain settled into place with a familiar clink. I didn't lock it out of anger anymore. I locked it out of care. Because some things aren't meant to be shortcuts. Some places aren't meant to be rushed. And some victories aren't about watching others fall, but about making sure what remains can stand for a long, long time. When darkness finally settled, the valley went quiet in that deep, living way I'd missed. No engines, no lights cutting through the night, just stars, cold and steady, and the sound of water moving exactly where it should. I went inside, poured a cup of coffee even though it was late, and sat at the table where it had all begun. The papers were gone now, filed away, no longer needed. The fight was over. What remained was something better. Peace earned, not given. Legacy protected, not sold. And a road that led exactly where it always had.